Right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in. Welcome to our second Co-opting AI event in the fall season of this year. This is actually the 16th Co-opting AI event in total, and I'm so thrilled to be hosting a fantastic panel tonight. Today, we will be discussing a topic that I've been really wanting to address in this series for a very long time, which is China's role in AI. And I'm so thrilled to be joined here today by three experts who have been doing exceptionally interesting and really relevant research on that topic for a long time. Shazida Ahmed, Sylvia Lindner, and Graham Webster. My name is Mona Sloan. I am a sociologist here at NYU. I work on inequality in the context of AI design and policy. I'm a fellow at NYU's Institute for Public Knowledge. I work with the GovLab as well as with NYU's Alliance for Public Interest Technology. I'm also an adjunct professor at NYU's Tannen School of Engineering. And I am also doing a little bit of work at Tisch, which is NYU's School of the Arts, where I develop a wonderful game on extraction, artificial intelligence, and the climate emergency with the wonderful Alina Constantine. Here at IPK, I convene the Co-opting AI series as well as co-convene the Shift, and I work with public books. Now, before we get going, I really want to thank the people who make this possible, and that is the generous support and sponsorship of the Institute for Public Knowledge, the 370J Project, and NYU's Department of Technology, Culture, and Society. Now, before I introduce the panelists in more detail and say a few words to frame the conversation for tonight, I want to acknowledge that by being in New York City, I'm standing on the unceded land of the Lenape people. And I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community and the indigenous communities on whose land you are currently located, and to commit to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Please also join me in thanking all the essential workers who work tirelessly to keep us safe every day here in New York and around the globe. I also want to take the opportunity to borrow the words of critical race and technology scholar and my NYU colleague, Charlton McElwain, to remind ourselves that in this country we are living through two pandemics, the COVID-19 pandemic and police brutality rooted in systemic racism and the continuous upholding of white privilege. And privilege is life, as we know. Just last Friday, the UK Office for National Statistics published a new study that showed a higher ethnic death risk is not linked to health, but to other factors, such as where people live and the kinds of jobs that they do. In the UK today, Black African, Black Caribbean, and Bangladeshi men are more than twice as likely as white men to die of COVID-19. What thankfully is not a privilege, but a right, is the right to vote. So as this is the last co-opting event before an undoubtedly extremely important election here in the United States, I encourage you all to turn to the ballot box and make your voice heard. Now to tonight's event. China has played a major role in pushing narratives and developing narratives called AI supremacy. The country's strong focus on AI innovation and deployment has large-scale impacts on the global funding patterns and the politics of knowledge production. AI is now central to how we imagine our socio-technical future and where we put our public funds. It has also become the arena for global competition and the negotiation of power, often subsumed under the buzzword AI arms race. Tonight, we will examine China's role in this so-called AI arms race, Chinese approaches to technology innovation, cybersecurity in China, as well as China's digital policy developments. At which point, I want to acknowledge that I myself am a Western scholar coming at this topic from a Western point of view. I have set the intent for myself to reflect on my position as Western, white, European, female, and middle class, and to listen and engage in that position, from that position, with the work that we're hearing about tonight. But enough about me. Please let me introduce our wonderful panelists. Starting the conversation tonight will be Shazida Ahmed, who is a PhD candidate at the School of Information at the University of California, Berkeley. She researches how tech firms and the Chinese government are collaboratively constructing the country's social credit system. Shazida is a pre-doctoral fellow at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence and at the Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation. She has worked as a researcher for the Citizen Lab, the MacArthur Institute for China Studies, and the Ranking Digital Rights Corporate Transparency Review by New America. She is the 2018-2019 academic in the 2018-2019 academic year, apologies, she was a Fulbright Fellow at Peking University's Law School. Welcome, Shazida. Following Shazida's remarks will be Graham Webster, who is a research scholar and editor of the DigiChina project at the Stanford University Cyber Policy Center and a fellow with New America. A joint effort of Stanford and New America, DigiChina is a collaborative project to translate, contextualize, and analyze Chinese digital policy documents and discourse. He was previously a senior fellow and lecturer at Yale Law School, where he was responsible for the Paul Tsai China Center's US-China track, 2 dialogues for 5 years before leading programming on cyberspace and high-tech issues. In the past, he wrote a CNET news blog on technology and society from Beijing, worked at the Center for American Progress, and taught East Asian politics at NYU Center for Global Affairs. Graham holds a master's degree in East Asian Studies from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree in journalism from Northwestern. Welcome, Graham. Thanks so much for joining us. Closing the panel discussion will be Sylvia Lindner, who is an associate professor at the University of Michigan in the School of Information and associate director at the Center for Ethics, Society, and Computing. Sylvia's research interests include cultures and politics of technology production in relation to past and ongoing shifts in work, labor, geopolitics, and governance. She draws from more than 10 years of multi-sided ethnographic research with a particular focus on China's place in the political economy of tech innovation. She is the author of the new book, Prototype Nation, China and the Contested Promise of Innovation, this one, which she'll be talking about today. The book reveals how our growing distrust in Western models of progress and development, including Silicon Valley and the tech industry, after the financial crisis 2007-8, shaped the vision of China as a new frontier of innovation. The book unpacks how this promise of entrepreneurial life has influenced governance, education, policy, investment, and urban redesign in ways that normalize the persistence of sexism, racism, colonialism, and labor exploitation. Sylvia's work contributes to the fields of STS, cultural and feminist anthropology, China studies, critical computing, global communication studies, science and tech policy, and design. Feel very at home with that too. Her research has been awarded support from the US National Science Foundation, IMLS, Intel Labs, Google Anita Borg, the Chinese National Natural Science Foundation, and it has appeared in many places, among them ACM, CW, STHV, STS, Social Context, Women's Studies Quarterly, China Information, and many others. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. 2 words about housekeeping before I hand over. We will be hearing from our panelists for about 10 to 15 minutes each. In the meantime, my team will be collecting questions on social media that you may have. We will then have a brief panel discussion between the 4 of us, and then I will open the floor to your questions, ask your questions, and we'll be engaging in a conversation. I am very pleased to say that we have closed captioning available, and the recording of this session will be available on YouTube right after we close. Now, enough from me. Shazida, thank you so much for joining. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Mona. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Great. There we go. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about what I wish we talk about when we talk about China and AI. And I want to take this rare opportunity to bring together some ideas that tie a lot of my research together. Most of my work interrogates how tech companies work with governments to implement policy, in China primarily, but not only there. So much of what I see written about China diverges from my experience as a researcher, that a question I find myself returning to often is, how do we develop the critical acumen needed to understand the social implications of technology developments in China? I'm going to provide historical context about the first AI Cold War, explain why the gap between policy and reality matters. Then I'll talk about how fieldwork has taught me to be skeptical of China tech narratives and in examining that gap. And then I want to end on what gives me hope in this field, that it often feels rife with dystopic, fatalistic narratives. One of the reasons we're here today is to discuss the so-called AI arms race between the US and China, a political construction that serves military, tech industry, and geopolitical interests on both sides of the Pacific. The one story I hope leaves an impression on anyone interested in this issue comes from science and technology studies scholar and historian Colin Garvey, who reminds us that in the 1980s, the US fabricated an AI arms race with Japan. Specifically in 1982, Japan started its fifth generation computer systems program, a non-military AI research and development project with goals including augmenting human labor, saving energy and resources, and coping with an aging society. Note that none of these were plans for the kinds of commercialized AI offerings that we're awash with today. In response, a few hawkish US computer science experts and DARPA representatives portrayed this program as a threat to the United States' global economic dominance, with at least three consequences. One, ramped up funding for US AI research and development. Two, other states believing the narrative that cast Japan as a challenger in an AI arms race. And finally, three, though other causes were of course a factor, the Japanese fifth generation computer systems program's own failure to reach its objectives. I think the image included here from a citation in Dr. Garvey's paper of a samurai with a computer in his belt alongside his swords speaks volumes about how racism was then and is still now part of the fear-mongering around non-US AI dominance. Experts invested in today's AI arms race should take heed of this history Dr. Garvey has laid bare and question who benefits from the rejuvenation of this bellicose framework today. Many people may have heard about the Chinese government's ambitious statements about and investments in AI development at a national and local level, as well as the setting of targets and milestones to hit, such as becoming the world's foremost AI superpower. Those of us who pore over and translate policy documents tend to look past these grand declarations and instead seek on-the-ground evidence that either backs them up or perhaps does not live up to these expectations. I draw attention to this discrepancy between the text of policy and the reality of how it is or isn't implemented to reach another point. That many examples invoked in breathless reporting about China's AI miracle actually rely on machine learning minimally, not at all, or in ways that raise the question of why ML would be used for a particular task. My dissertation research on China's social credit system is one prime example. The social credit system is a set of policies and practices whose goal is to ensure compliance with administrative law. It is not a scoring system whereby the government accesses the entire corpus of citizens' personal data and uses this data to essentially judge people's morality. AI is not used for the main computational work of this system, such as data sharing between courts, companies, and the more than 4 dozen government bureaus tasked with implementing sanctions on lawbreakers. It is astounding that 6 years into social credits having become a topic of international concern, many experts have still not come to terms with this less thrilling understanding of it. But like the AI arms race story, social credit is shorthand for perceptions of China that can be shored up to serve certain political goals. This isn't to say that social credit is without its harms. My work looks at how tech companies' involvement in tracking down, shaming, and otherwise pressuring individuals on the court's behalf harms privacy, reputation, and social and economic opportunities. Yet these are largely a function of Chinese law, not of automation. At a minimum, I want to flag AI washing as one trend we see in China as well as the US. I also want to point out another hole in the argument that China is operating the world's most sophisticated, omnipotent technological surveillance state, namely the revival of Mao-era style surveillance, wherein ordinary citizens are tasked with closely monitoring their neighbors for unusual and illegal behavior. One example is the Feng Chao experience, in which senior citizens report on community-level suspicious activity to the police. Tech companies are capitalizing upon this type of surveillance between citizens by creating apps that to date seem to be unsuccessful. Not everyone wants to snitch on the people the people in their community where they've developed social ties. Even in Xinjiang, where a slew of surveillance technologies that do not appear to be using AI are nevertheless stripping Uyghurs of their civil and human rights in every aspect of daily life, the local government still employs human surveillors to report on out-of-the-ordinary behavior that does not break laws. I draw attention to this mobilization of people as informants to serve as a small reminder that surveillance technology does not always possess the power its deployers want us to believe it does, and that we must always interrogate their claims. That brings me back to the distinction I made earlier, the question about what happens between when a policy is made and when it is implemented in the real world. This feels almost unfathomable to ask for in the COVID era, but having done field research in China and cultivated personal and professional ties there, as Sylvia and Graham also have, I find it increasingly important to do research in the country if we are to advance conversations beyond news headlines. Even now, while I'm unable to go to China due to the pandemic, the insights from my field research have informed a new report my co-author Vidushi Marta and I will be publishing, an investigation of how machine learning is used in commercial applications of emotion recognition technology in China. Emotion recognition, or the analysis of biometric data such as facial expression, vocal tone, body movement, heart rate, and skin conductance, in order to infer a person's internal emotional state, is neither new nor limited to China, of course. In the US and South Korea, companies like HireVue perform similar functions to conduct job interviews. Taking this one project as an example, another way I want to point out similarities between China and just about anywhere else involves how companies, governments, academic researchers, and others insist upon technological solutions to social problems. Across China, there's an earnest belief in technology's power to change society for the better, and in some instances, an even patriotic sense of pride and perception of Chinese companies' abilities to do this. Professor and new media scholar Wendy Chun captures this dynamic perfectly in stating that crises are not accidental to a culture focused on safety. Rather, Chun says, they are its reason for existence. In the emotion recognition research, my co-author and I often found arguments about convenience, that border inspections using emotion recognition to detect people behaving guiltily, for example, would be less invasive because they're contactless and inconspicuous. That by speeding up the process, people would feel less discriminated against, despite the counter-arguments that such systems are plagued with the potential to discriminate against people underrepresented in their training data or just among many other possibilities for misuse. We found appeals to particular crises. For instance, in response to a now famous instance where kindergarten teachers were found physically abusing students in Beijing, we saw emotion recognition firms claiming that their technology could detect fear among students as an early warning of mistreatment. Similarly, in response to the recent sexual assaults committed by drivers for Didi Tuxing, China's ride-hailing equivalent of Uber, we saw emotion recognition companies say their technology ought to be used in the gig economy to detect signs that a driver would become violent. This idealistic framing of emotions, measured in facial expressions, itself a limited and questionable approach, as the canary in the coal mine, ignores the harder questions. How do we vet teachers and drivers? What are the social conditions that lead to the kinds of incidents I described? And how do we prevent harm to vulnerable individuals? Something I wish more people were aware of is that a lot of the critical discourse in the US that pushes back on technological solutionism, the idea that, say, ubiquitous face recognition cameras will reduce crime, is starting to emerge at a much reduced scale in certain corners of Chinese academia and online spaces for people who closely follow technology developments in China. As a paper by Redyetta Debe and colleagues notes, computing acts as a synecdoche, a part that stands in for the larger whole in discourse and critique. Computing can offer us a tractable focus through which to notice anew or bring renewed attention to old problems. I see this more and more on Chinese social media and in Chinese news reporting. Criticisms of new apps, technological pilot tests, They are at times a way to ask bigger questions about dissatisfactions with labor, access to education, and other social issues. This emergence of critical questioning is a big motivator of my research, and on a personal note, a source of hope. You'll notice that nothing I've said is specific to China, a thought which at its worst gets reduced to whataboutism, the idea that we can say other countries do this too, and often end the conversation there. I hope instead for these comparisons to become a starting point for doing much needed transregional work. Learning about tech developments in China does not just teach us about China, but about the social effects of technology more broadly. I'm hopeful when I see small signs of resistance. In the emotion recognition report, we translated testimonials from a now well-known example of a school in Hangzhou that adopted behavior and emotion recognition software from face recognition firm Hikvision. Within the same month, the school deployed Hikvision cameras hooked up to software that claimed to detect when students were focused on the lecture or when they were playing on their phones. Public pushback, both from parents as well as commenters on Chinese social media, led the trial to wind down. There's also been a recent critique of face recognition in China, mostly at the margins, which I'm happy to talk about in the discussion. I'm excited by work coming out of China, like the Nandu Personal Information Protection Research Center's rigorous surveys and investigative work on privacy and data breaches. In a research literature review I worked on, where I wanted to understand how algorithmic discrimination and bias are talked about in China, I was heartened to see a growing trend across several Mandarin language research papers. The call for AI ethics to be taught in Chinese universities, specifically to engineers and others who will design the technology used to make decisions in everyday life. Finally, I am heartened by the products of fieldwork like Sylvia's and one of my new favorite books, Xiaowei Wang's Blockchain Chicken Farm, in which they investigate technological interventions into rural food production, from chicken farming that uses blockchain to verify the poultry was safely sourced, to agricultural big data modeling that advises on when to plant and harvest crops, among other examples. In the book, we see examples of whole new forms of labor the technology creates. For instance, the operation of agricultural drones to monitor conditions on farms, which imbues the drone operator Wang interviews with a sense of purpose. Yet Wang also poignantly captures the flip side of the consequences when the drone operation firm announces new improvements that would obviate the need for drone operators, enabling farmers to operate drones directly. As quickly as this new type of work appears, with its own social meaning and the excitement it generates, it can just as quickly be taken away. My hope is that we see more of our local social contexts in stories like these and open up alternate ways of seeing China. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shazita, for this fascinating insight. You had me fill a whole page of notes, and I can't wait for the discussion later. Really appreciate it. Graham, please take the stage.
Okay, thank you so much. And what a great opening from Shazita. I'm going to attempt to share my screen, which is always a minor adventure, but hopefully it'll work. And success. Nope. You know, you'd think I would have gotten better at this by now, but here we are. I think we're all in business. As was mentioned, my role, I'm a researcher and editor of a collaborative project called DigiChina, based at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center and at New America. And what we do is we gather and then translate and try to provide context and explanation for Chinese tech policy developments. And this really stretches fairly widely, all the way from kind of top level leadership speeches in which, rhetoric they push down to the very nitty gritty stuff of how data governance is going to be handled, personal privacy, national security data, and that type of stuff. So today I'm going to talk about just a few themes and then go through a brief cascade of a few different AI-related policy documents and their context. I'll wrap up with a couple of kind of interpretive views that I and others have advanced over the last few years, and leave hopefully plenty of time for discussion after Sylvia's talk. I think the most kind of basic level to start at, when we think about this conversation about China and tech and AI and an AI arms race or a race for AI supremacy, you have to start from an honest assessment that we have panic here. And especially, this slide is a little bit cartoonish. I like to draw it on a whiteboard, but we don't do that these days. But in the US especially, I think that our society is undergoing at least three different panics. One is about economic transformation and jobs and automation. One is about what it means for our personal autonomy and control over things and our privacy and the relationships in society when technology and artificial intelligence advance. And then there's a general China-specific panic about power shifts and a loss of the assumption of US supremacy and ability to kind of affect the world. I think that all of these things are justifiable reasons to be nervous, but I think it's interesting to note that nobody really has much of an idea about how to deal with any of them. I mean, we see on the jobs and economic transformation side, this is the type of anxiety that fueled both the Donald Trump and the Bernie Sanders rise 4 years ago. On tech and AI, we have all kinds of things going on in US policy when it comes to antitrust, and people are contemplating privacy laws, and nobody quite knows which direction it's going to go. And as somebody who has spent years on US policy toward China, I can tell you from personal experience that there's, even among specialists and people who agree on so many things, there's very little agreement about what to do about the change in the balance of comparative power between the US and Chinese governments or militaries or economies. And at the center of all this, you have this sort of vague panic about AI and China. Well, that's a perfect way to begin. And to realize that there was a huge panic, or just, also justified attention around the 2017 New Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan that was released by the State Council, that's the government rather than the party in the Chinese system, in 2017. And this document was prepared primarily by the Ministry of Science and Technology Infrastructure, and they set out these really eye-catching goals that really created a lot of headlines around the world. So you don't have to read all these words, but the thing that got everybody going was this set of time delineated goals by 2020 to be in step with globally advanced levels. And this is the translation that our DigiChina project did. This is one of our early pieces that really built momentum for the group. And it's tied directly to strongly supporting China's entrance into the ranks of innovative nations and comprehensively achieving the struggle toward the goal of moderately prosperous society, which is a hallmark of Chinese government and Communist Party rhetoric. Second, by 2025, now we're talking about major breakthroughs in basic theories, not just applications, and reaching a world leading level, not just globally advanced. What really caught people's attention was the third goal by 2030 for theories, technologies, and applications all together to achieve world leading levels, which and the language is making China the world's primary AI innovation center. It's arguable to read this as China as the supreme AI innovation center or the supreme leader of AI development, or at least on par with any others. But one way or the other, this caught a lot of attention. So, this type of ambition pretty directly characterized the sense of a race for AI supremacy or for national leadership in AI, setting aside whether that makes any sense, whether AI is a category that is coherent enough to be led by a nation. This was a major step in the discourse. Something that, as Shazita mentioned, one of the big benefits of actually going and conducting either field work or dialogue or developing relationships and having conversations with colleagues in China is that you learn about what comes behind these types of documents. And in this case, I happen to be able to help organize a meeting between US and Chinese thinkers about tech policy. And one of the things we learned is that some of the drafters of the Chinese AI development plan that was released in 2017, well, they had gotten off their asses after they had read these two documents from October 2016 from the White House, where the US government had identified the broad category of artificial intelligence as both an opportunity and a challenge for various types of policy. And they put out these documents. What we learned was this notion that the US government was trying to get on top of AI, whatever that means, led to a need for the Chinese bureaucracy to also get on top of AI, whatever that means. And so I think it's important to kind of just generally understand that we're dealing in a situation where everybody's a little unsure what to do, and we're also dealing in a situation where internationally there are these sort of grand gestures that need to get matched. By different bureaucratic actors. And that leads to a bit of a show where the actual situation under the hood is a little bit more complicated. So I want to talk about a few of the ways it's more complicated. First, here's a piece that we published as part of a special report on AI policy in China that came out just about a year ago, and the first sort of group of the pieces, and we still have some that are going to be coming out over the next few months. But this was a wonderful piece by May Nelson, who's a longtime analyst of China's tech policies, science and tech policies. And she documented this debate inside China where there were some people who were saying essentially that China should follow this what's seen as an old-fashioned approach to competing in technology. These are discourses that go back decades, to introduce, digest, absorb, and re-innovate essentially foreign origin technologies, things that have been developing elsewhere. And then there's, if they're not going to just assimilate, if they're going to develop a new leading technology, there were debates of these phrases: overtake by alternative routes, which is to say, really take your own path, build something completely different that's going to win, or just overtake on the curve to try to race, to outrun the competitor in terms of the actual technology. And the way that this actually boils down is this is a huge debate about whether things should be market driven, whether they should be state driven, who should have the power to decide how to allocate resources associated with these big national ambitions. And frankly, it's quite clear that there's not a lot of consensus on this. Another piece that we published in that little collection was by Benjamin Larson. He documented this dynamic where certain companies were given special roles in various industries, and here's a sort of array of them. And Hikvision is one of the, it's a massive surveillance company that Shazita has mentioned. Some of these we've all heard of: Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, which owns WeChat, and of course Huawei, which is enormously controversial these days. In each case, the government would give individual companies special access to a sector or to government data or to other kind of resources. But in exchange, these companies are kind of deputized to try to implement some of the government priorities for how these sectors should develop. So it really shows that the national ambition does get broken down significantly on the Chinese side, but we're just going to have to see how successful a lot of these things are. I mean, the cybersecurity company there, 360, is very popular in China. It's the default option for at least for enterprise users in China, but it doesn't have a lot of traction around the world. And how much of this really has anything to do with AI, and what does that mean, is always in the background. A couple more themes to go through. There's a lot of attention in China to AI security, and what does AI security mean? Here's a translated image from, it's a chart from a white paper by a group called CAICT, which is a think tank under the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. And they identify security risks in different applications. And then they highlight this idea of controllable. Secure and controllable is a watchword in a lot of the top level Chinese policies. And what this really boils down to is independent capabilities, things that both are not under the control of a foreign adversary, someone like the United States, and are not necessarily something where China could lose access due to actions from another country, especially the United States. More recently, we've been talking about decoupling quite a lot. This stretches across things that are obviously AI related and just many other industries. I really recommend, if people are interested in the policy challenges facing the US and China going forward, that they take a look at this piece that we published about a month and a half ago by 4 amazing authors. Yen Luo is a partner with the Covington law firm in Beijing. Sam Sachs is a fellow at New America and at the Yale Law School. Naomi Wilson works for ITI, the US tech industry lobby. And Abigail Copeland is a professor at Vassar who studies sociology and science and technology studies with a very fieldwork grounded approach, especially in biotech in China. They documented these huge ways in which the two systems, over their panics, I think, about mutual power relationships and about the advance of technology, are tearing apart the fabric of collaboration and technological progress. And there's just so many factors there, and it aligns with the sort of nationalistic and overall uncertainty and concern element here. Now, I'm going to I think I'm going to close here. I had a couple more things to do, but I don't want to take up too much time. So I really look forward to the discussion, and this has been great so far. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Graham. Again, fascinating contribution. I have another page filled with notes and questions and can't wait for the conversation. Sylvia, please close us off with your contribution.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Mona, for this kind introduction earlier. I'm super excited to be here. I hope you can see my slides. Yes, okay, great. So in this talk today, I'll be drawing, as Mona already mentioned, from my new book, Prototype Nation, China and the Contested Promise of Innovation. The book is based on multi-sided ethnographic research that has spanned sort of the last 10 years, including fieldwork in China and the United States, but also parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. And for the purposes of this talk today, I will share some ethnographic stories, but also some historical details, specifically around a key theme that I develop in the book, the Entrepreneurial Factory. So I want to begin with this story by centering 2 dominant stories about technology in China that pervades the Western media. One story celebrates China as a new model of innovation that the West must learn from, or as Wired Magazine put it, it is time to copy China. The other story, and we've heard already a little bit about this from Shishida, is the story about China as a surveillance state and a threat to Western liberal democracies because of its ill use of technology, most recently AI and machine learning, for the purposes of control. This story has most recently culminated, as all of you already talked about. Oops, I'm sorry for the slide mess up. So this has recently culminated in speculations of the formation of a new tech Cold War. And so while these 2 stories might appear like really 2 opposing views, I argue that they actually have quite a bit in common. So fundamentally, these 2 stories both share the belief that the advancement of technology, with AI as the most recent example, is inevitable. And they both tell the story of China via claims of rupture and newness. And so in my new book, Prototype Nation, I complicate such narratives of what the historian Gabriel Hecht has called rupture talk. I suggest that the notion of rupture can neither explain China's current moment, nor can it explain the role that digital technologies play in our shifting geopolitics. And so the interesting question is not what makes China newly or uniquely innovative, or is China a threat to Western democracy? Instead, the important question, and the one that I answer in the book, is to examine what gave rise to this specific contemporary story of China as a new model. So either China as promising or China to be feared, but fundamentally China as a new model, as a prototype nation, and then to show what such stories of China as prototype nation produce and the worlds they then make. So in the book, I show in much detail how China as prototype nation is deeply intertwined with a much broader coming to terms with the broken promises of Western modernity itself. Specifically, following the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis, a range of austerity measures and neoliberal restructuring normalized the proliferation of various forms of precarious work via tech platforms and tech investment in particular. In the years that followed, it became more and more clear that the technologies that had long been celebrated as enablers of revolutionary change had long been, in fact, complicit in labor exploitation, ruthless neoliberal capitalism, and various forms of oppression. And so I show in the book how it was in this very moment of doubt over technological promise that attitudes towards China began to shift. People who were active, especially in the worlds of design, engineering, and venture capital investment, began turning to China, and more precisely to a region in the south of China surrounding the city of Shenzhen. Within the time span of really only a couple of years, the region became rewritten in the global tech imagination. So what had long been decried as a site of mere execution of Western ideas, as a place of low quality and copycat production, became suddenly celebrated as the Silicon Valley of hardware, the ultimate maker city, a hothouse of innovation, a city-sized hackerspace where hardware entrepreneurs get to innovate, a new model of innovation that would compete with Silicon Valley. These visions of a quote-unquote new China were articulated by powerful actors whose voices, often male and often from the global north, were heard by international media and some of the media that I'm citing here, but also by investors, politicians, educators, and many more. For instance, in a 2014 TED Talk, Choi Ito describes his experiences when he was still director at the MIT Media Lab and traveled with his students and faculty to Shenzhen. Upon his return, he described in this TED Talk his experiences as that Shenzhen was like going back in time, learning from the past, momentarily reliving the foundations of Japan's technological and economic success. And you can see here a quote from the talk on the screen. A discourse of adventure and exploration engulfed such inventions of China, visible also in this quote here from the director of a Silicon Valley-funded incubator program that opened its doors in Shenzhen in 2013. Chinese people here are articulated as making things happen and as providing agency to the Western innovator, engineer, and designer who had begun to increasingly fear the feminization of his own creative work. So Shenzhen was a place where men like this one could feel like men again. They could feel in control. The casual reference to the pop science fiction series Star Trek that you see here at the end of the quote of boldly going where no man has gone before is not to underestimate in this context. As a narrative of American frontierism, references to Star Trek legitimized an engagement with China based on a masculine and colonial narrative of adventure, exploration, and technological mastery. And it was a trope that I kept hearing over and over, not just in this one particular case of an interview with the director of the investment program. So the idea was that if space was the final frontier to be mastered by individuals empowered by the latest technological advances, like the story of Star Trek portrays, then China was the untamed land of copycat to be mastered by the maker and geek turned entrepreneur and startup. The colonial narrative of China as other here served the purposes and interests of investment. China's otherness was portrayed as an opportunity to recuperate the technological promise of adventure and revolutionary change in the very moment it was widely critiqued. In 2013, I spent a year as an ethnographer embedded in one such foreign incubator in Shenzhen. Appropriating socialist imagery of China's past, the program pitched this colonial approach to China in revolutionary terms. Here, geeks would become entrepreneurs to hack not only products, but hack capitalism. So was the promise. During my ethnographic engagement, I spent much of my time with two women, Sophie and Mei Yun, who were hired as Chinese staff workers by the incubator. This is how the director of the incubator introduced the two women on the first day of the program. There's a thing about Sophie and Mei Yun, he said. They are the office managers. They make our lives better. They will make sure shit works around here. If it doesn't work, just remember it must be their fault. Repeat after me, nothing is my fault, it must be their fault. When shit is broken, talk to them. The introduction to the two female Chinese staff set the tone for the startups of how they would approach them over the months to follow. Their job was to help guide them through the emotional ups and downs of venture labor. When shit was broken, they would fix it. When the stress levels amongst the startups went up, Sophie and Mei Yun would provide distraction and think of leisure activities. The responsibility was, unlike the startups on the ground, to stay in the background, to take care of the program's day-to-day functioning and the startup's well-being. Over the years of research, I met many young women and some young Chinese men who were hired into positions not unlike Sophie and Mei Yun. They were hired to perform happiness labor. By happiness labor, I refer to the work that goes into producing a feeling of optimism and cheerful delight. It's the kind of labor that a range of new organizational models of tech production, from incubator spaces to maker spaces and open innovation labs, rely on in order to sustain the very precarious conditions of entrepreneurial labor itself. Happiness labor allows the entrepreneur, so to say, to sustain a good feeling about technology, despite the increasing realization that for many, self-investment will never pay off. In 2015, then, the Chinese government began endorsing these transnational incubator and maker spaces that had legitimized happiness labor for the promise of hacking capitalism, following an official visit of Prime Minister Li Keqiang. And you can see here photos of the Prime Minister in one of these maker spaces. Following his visit, the government launched a new policy that translates loosely into English as incubator spaces or maker spaces for the people. The government saw them as ideal training grounds for a generation of young Chinese men who would remake themselves after the image of the Western and mostly white maker turned entrepreneur who Shenzhen had attracted. Old production sites were redesigned to induce desires in workers and engineers to turn themselves into entrepreneurs who the nation would be proud of and whose technologies were data-driven and by extension investable. So Internet of Things, data-driven systems, smart robotics. The aim was to build up what I call in the book the Entrepreneurial Factory. The Entrepreneurial Factory produces not products, but feelings. It is aimed at inducing in factory workers, in engineers and designers, to see themselves as passionate entrepreneurial change makers, to turn themselves into assets on behalf of the nation and its global aspirations, and some of the very aspirations that both Graham and Chasida already talked about. In my research, I followed several young men working in the production industry who this policy had targeted to understand how it affected them. One of them was Robin. When I first met him, he was 30 years old. He had moved to Shenzhen from a rural part of China at the urging of a relative who helped him obtain a fellowship at a local manufacturer to leave behind his life in agriculture. In 2016, upon one of my return visits to Shenzhen, I traveled to Robin's office at the outskirts of the city. He had invited me to meet him over tea to tell me about an exciting new business opportunity. A childhood friend from his hometown in rural Hunan had opened up a shoe factory in Ethiopia. The idea was that Robin would get a section of the factory to have some of his own products assembled there. The shoe factory's promotional materials that you can see here on the screen echoed some of the official rhetoric of the CCP around its Belt and Road Initiative that posits China and its economic development as a model for Africa. There was no direct government support, Robin told me. The expectation was that people like him would self-invest by going out, or 出去 in Chinese. While the personal and professional risks could be high, going out was understood by people like Robin as carrying potential to redeem China from a place that was known as low quality to cutting edge innovation and the next leader in technological futures, by way of upgrading himself from a backwards producer into a globally savvy entrepreneur. A year later, when I returned to Shenzhen and met with Robin, he had moved to a new office located in one of Shenzhen's newest and most prime real estates, Shenzhen Bay. As we sat in his new office, 30 floors up the modern high-rise overlooking a pristine golf course, he showed me the video conferencing system he had set up and the photos from his latest trip to Ethiopia and Kenya. This was not it, however, he interrupted himself. He said, I envy you, and he speaks to me, you're respected, no matter where you go. When I go to Africa, or if I went to the United States, I'm not respected. That's why we still have aspirations. That's why we hope to be respected. This is my goal. I'm pursuing this goal, and that's why, although today I could have a really good life, I'm still living the life of a loser. The entrepreneurial factor runs on this very promise of the good life, which is continuously postponed for many Chinese men like Robin, deemed low quality and still not representative of the nation's modern ambitions in AI and other things, and especially for many Chinese women who are relegated to happiness labor. I built her on the feminist and critical race scholar Sarah Ahmed, who describes the promise of the good life, of happiness, as inextricably linked to colonialism. In her words, the civilizing mission of the colonial periods could be described as a happiness mission. Colonized people were framed as lacking the qualities or attributes necessary for a happy state of existence. They're required to mimic, in other words, the colonizer by approximating their habits. Such mimicry reproduces violence in the form of continuous postponement, almost the same but not quite, almost the same but not white, almost happy but not quite. The Chinese Communist Party state continuously and strategically invokes China's colonial past, which it refers to as the period of national humiliation. It portrays its own citizens as lacking in international comparison and is in need of modern upgrade. Only then will the nation be redeemed, and AI is really just the latest playing field for that. The Entrepreneurial Factory, so to say, serves exactly this project. It's a form of control that operates through the promise of entrepreneurial agency that legitimizes racialized and gendered exploitation in the present, with justice continuously postponed. So coming back full circle to the beginning of my talk, the violence of the Entrepreneurial Factory, the sexism and racism it normalizes, is co-produced both by Western fears of loss and uncertainty on the one hand, and long-held post-colonial desires of the Communist Party state, on the other hand, to redeem China on a national and global level. And with this, I would like to thank you. I'm just listing a couple of ways how you can reach me, and I now very much look forward to questions, comments, and conversations between all four of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for this fascinating insight. And thanks again to Shazida and Graham for your contributions as well. I'm just going to delve right in because I have a ton of questions, and we also have audience questions. Again, a reminder, at any point, if you have questions or comments for each other, just shoot. This is a question for all of you. What kind of tied your talks together was a focus on narratives, on narratives around technology, techno-solutionism, and how this translates into policy, into innovation, into narratives abroad. You all lived in China, you all did work there. So I wonder if you could tell us, me and the audience, stories from the ground. How do people today, maybe friends you have in China, talk about artificial intelligence and technology in their daily lives? Is it a topic at all? What kinds of, again, narratives come up? When I talk to folks here, either in the US, but also in Europe, I teach a class called AI in Society. What I hear a lot is the robot takeover or robot fear. So there are very particular narratives that I hear over and over again that I sometimes also find in policy documents. So I wonder if there are any particular narratives that you hear on the ground that sort of talk about artificial intelligence in a particular way. And maybe we start with Shazida.
Yeah, just two things that come to mind that kind of fit with what I was talking about, and I think that's why they stand out to me. Is like I'm attuned to when people talk about things breaking or not doing what you expect them to do. So in interviews for my dissertation, where I talked to local governments about their local attempts to create like sometimes scoring systems, but mostly just kind of systems of like looking at government held data to determine if people are breaking the law and like what kinds of perks can they give them, kind of the equivalent of like a fast track at the DMV, right? Something that the government itself can offer, not necessarily as enticing as like a tech company giving you a discount. And when I asked them, well, are you using data from, these tech companies, you're cooperating with your local big data research center, and they would say, well, actually, private sector held data is really hard to verify. And so we kind of just have to use what the government itself has produced because we know it's verifiable. And to me, that was really interesting because it kind of flies in the face of one of the big sort of cliches I hear a lot, and I'm trying to figure out how to work against, which is this idea that tech companies kind of have this open pool of data that the Chinese government can just like reach, a fist into and take whatever they want. Like, I think it's a little more complicated than that. It's certainly not great. But hearing something like that really grounded me in, okay, what does this look like for the person trying to implement this very local system? What are their kind of setbacks and limitations? And it reminds me also of when I talk to some researchers who have done quite a bit on privacy, or actually, no, sorry, you know what? Different group. I was talking to a company I interviewed. We had lunch and we were talking about surveillance cameras. And they said, a lot of these don't work. Like the minute your house gets robbed, you find out that the camera in front of your door never worked. So we often ignore these things. And I just found that really interesting, that kind of like skepticism, because of course many of them work, but it was this idea that it would never actually help you.
Thank you, Shazida. Do you wanna take that cue, Graham, on sort of things don't work? Is this reflected amongst policymakers, or is it a completely different ballgame?
Well, I think what comes to mind for me when I think about the AI narrative among the people that I speak to in China, who usually these days, I used to have kind of more regular friends, I would talk to my neighbors, and I would, I played in a couple of bands, so you'd talk to musicians who aren't, scholars of anything in particular. That was another time. Now, most of the people I talk to work on tech policy, and they study international narratives of tech policy, and they compare between China's approaches and the domestic approaches, and they're part of formal exchanges. But what I notice is sort of a similarity between that community in the US and that community in China, where there is a little bit of wry analytic distance, or just a little bit of joking about whatever this AI thing is. And people, to me, I would say people get it. I mean, they get that AI is a buzzword, and that it's a buzzword in China just as much as it's a buzzword in the US. And even it was probably 3 or 4 years ago when people started saying, oh, the AI bubble is over. It's going to be blockchain for now, and then we're going to do the next thing next. So there's a outward consciousness that these things are fads. Nonetheless, they're important. How we handle data security and personal information protection, something that I've worked with a lot of people on. How U.S. China, in the case of the conversations I have, should handle their mutual suspicion and kind of increase security where the governments think they need it, but not completely shut down the entire innovation ecosystem. These types of things are pretty widespread. But when it comes to AI, I think people get it. It's a little bit of a, it's a useful category to get some meetings done and to have a conference and to get a book and maybe get some funding. But, what is it? Well, it is a narrative and they get it.
Thanks for that. I appreciate that. Sylvia, you studied that extensively, and you studied that with people who were sort of enrolled in innovation, at least technology innovation, even though it might not have been, labeled as AI innovation. Did you have the same conversations with them as you had with maybe people you lived with or, hung out with while you were there over the course of 10 years?
Yeah, I was just about to sort of build on both Shazida and Graham's commentary about humor, because that's what I get from most of my interlocutors and friends in China when it comes to AI. And I think there's a lot of, I would say, critical engagement with exactly what Graham was just saying, that it has become a useful category that attracts media attention, that tells a particular kind of sensationalist story about China or about China-US relations. So a lot of my friends, who are in that space of the tech industry, or even friends outside of that, comment with a lot of humor on that, and I get like memes sent and things like that. So I think there's a lot of critical engagement through humor, but at times also to make sense of how geopolitics are shifting by talking about how AI is portrayed and how AI is used to portray a shifting relationship between China and the world. So I think in many ways what is interesting about that is that I think what we might have not seen so much happening in broader public discourse is sort of a critical unpacking of these dominant narratives and of media coverage is happening on a sort of everyday basis in like WeChat conversations. So, and people do comment about it, well, what will it be next week? So today it's AI and then it will be this other thing. And there's a suspicion of that replacement of one trend with the other that I hear both from people working in sort of the tech sector and people outside of it, which I think is interesting.
Thank you, Sylvia. I'm going to pick that right up and ask a question about education. So what we're seeing quite a bit, at least in Europe and certainly also in the US, is kind of the narrative that we need to heavily invest into STEM education, particularly into education for folks who want to do machine learning, so engineering, and so on. Do we see that in China as well, Shazida?
I don't follow the education sector as closely, so I don't feel like I have a great answer to that, but I'm not sure if Graham or Sylvia has followed it more than I have.
Graham, maybe do you have a take on this?
I would just say that it's clearly in the government plans, and so again, but I haven't studied the real implementation level. I don't know to what extent these things are actually being set up, but there's a great amount of announcement of funding and intention to develop AI industry clusters or big data clusters, and there was a massive push that's going to be connected with the 13th five-year plan that to push strategic emerging industries, which is a category that's existed for at least a decade, and they keep changing the list of industries, and some of it is AI, but it's not. I can't comment specifically on who's learning TensorFlow or whatever like that. So I think you'd want to learn it if you were going to do tech stuff.
Thank you. Sylvia, I was so intrigued by your notion of happiness labor and sort of the gender lens that you used to analyze your extensive data and research. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how gender was played out in the spaces that you studied in these technology spaces, and give a bit more detail on that notion of happiness labor versus the male entrepreneur.
Sure, yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. Maybe you can loop it back into this conversation around education, because I think it's an important one. Because in many ways, the incubator spaces that I studied and the ones that we've seen proliferate, across regions and actually many university spaces, have been positioned as a new model of education. They're pitched as the alternative to bureaucratic top-down university education. They're pitched as producing entrepreneurs and people who matter and who shape the economy in ways that is portrayed as having extra urgency with economic upheaval. So incubators are really pitched as, pitch themselves, and even universities pitch incubators as a way to revamp broken educational systems. Like our own university, University of Michigan, has its own incubator, and many other universities do as well. And that particular incubator where I was doing a lot of my field work, as well as many other of these programs that I studied through interviews, were very male dominated. Many of them had almost exclusively male mentors and male program managers. And it was very hard. So for instance, while the time when I was embedded as an ethnographer, that particular incubator had only one female entrepreneur, in addition to the 2 female Chinese staff workers who were hired. And so there was really also no role model for these women, and especially not for women of color, who they could turn to when things became difficult. You know how important it is for women of color and other people who might be historically excluded from sites of privilege, how important it is for them to have role models who act like them, who share various forms of exclusions that they have experienced as well. And there was really nobody to turn to, and this created a sort of really dire situation for a lot of the women, in that sense that there was very little solidarity also that formed between them. And I experienced this firsthand as also being one of the few women in that space. And so that model, especially because some of these early incubator spaces in Shenzhen in particular were foreign funded. They were legitimized by these, Western investment programs tied to Silicon Valley. They were sanctioned by American universities. And exactly because they had that Western endorsement, they became these models for other incubator programs at Chinese universities, reproducing the same kind of sexism, that they had built in because of its Silicon Valley sort of enactments of masculinity. And so I did some sort of research on the side while I was at Fudan University as a postdoc, where some of these programs also shaped higher education, and where it was particularly hard for young Chinese women in engineering and the computer sciences to find a space, even harder than before, right? These incubator models really championed a young male Chinese entrepreneur, and there was very little room for women.
Thanks for all of that insight. It's fascinating to hear about the exporting of Silicon Valley's model as also export of sexism and gender discrimination in that industry, and seeing how that played out. Graham, you said that both countries are tearing apart the fabric of collaboration, which I found was a fascinating statement. Could you, again, give a bit more body to that notion and tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's quite a moment to discuss this particular question, because a lot will hinge on the result of the US election, both in terms of who wins the election and then how it goes between now and the next administration. But quickly, if we were to rewind before the 2016 election, it was already clear that Americans in the policy community were very concerned about increasing technology-related vulnerability to China. And the Huawei example is the prototypical one. The idea is if the United States or some other country installs Huawei infrastructure, this would potentially give the Chinese government an advantage in its future efforts to either spy or sabotage, the target country's systems. It's an advantage in war or in peace, et cetera. That type of thinking now suffuses the entire technological space. And it goes along both that supply chain question, the idea of, are we dependent on, we, whoever we are? And so this works both ways. Both the Chinese side and the US side are very concerned about dependency on one another. And it's for infiltration. So does the potential adversary gain some control and some leverage over everyday life, especially as more and more things are connected and automated and more autonomous systems exist in ways that are fairly opaque. And the second is, does the adversary country have a stranglehold on individual components? So the obvious case now is the US efforts to deny Chinese access to high-level semiconductors in various ways. So it's, whether it's an export control thing or a sanctions violation thing, or the various tools that the US has used. So I would argue, and I think that the research that we published by the 4 authors I mentioned earlier kind of shows that there are all these little measures to try to pull back from that dependency and that potential risk of integration. And some of them are quite kind of reasonable on the face of them, but when you add them up, it becomes harder to trade. It becomes harder to build technological systems that draw on the best available from wherever it might be produced, whether it's in the US or China or elsewhere. And then a lot of these things, the last thing I'll say is that many of these policies amount to either a full stop on allowing certain types of people to move. I mean, it's the physical movement of people. Remember when we used to do that before COVID? Well, taking apart the pandemic, it was already getting very difficult for some types of people to travel between the US and China because of visa restrictions, and to work in each other's organizations because there's increased sort of nationality-based scrutiny, which unfortunately in the US has also led to essentially race-based discrimination and scrutiny of people. Typically if you're going to discriminate based on nationality, you might not be so careful about figuring out whether a person is actually Chinese or actually part of the national security state. And it unfortunately extends to a lot of researchers and students and technical experts who are Asian or Asian American, and it's just a rash of really yellow peril, menace type fear, and frankly, the Trump administration has been building that intentionally. So all of that amounts to a kind of thrashing of what had been a very lively U.S.-China innovation space with people traveling back and forth and investment and licensing and all kinds of other involvement.
Thank you, Graham. That was a really fascinating thing you said there about pulling back the smaller dependencies, which then sort of mounts to this tearing apart of the fabric as you described it. And the reason why I find that so interesting is because we're also talking about, here as well about sort of new decentralized systems and sort of more localized interventions, policy interventions, technology interventions as a way to move forward. So that's interesting if we put that in the context of global trade, research collaborations, and so on, specifically with China. I'm going to start folding in some wonderful audience questions that we've been receiving. And Shazida, the first one is for you. And this is from Luke Munn, who is asking if policy documents, press releases, government reports overstate the power of AI, what are some practical ways, such as in field research, you've grasped the conditions on the ground in China with?
I have a lot of thoughts on that. I think one of the things is when you read these enough, you start to figure out what kinds of phrases appear a lot and then don't necessarily materialize. So like we've talked about, years as particular milestones, or phrases like every single person, every single company. Some of these goals are massive, especially when you look at the scale of how things happen in China. Like I remember talking to, a few like policy researchers in Beijing, and one of the things that was most impressive about social credit was that multiple dozens of government bureaus had coordinated data sharing. Like that, the formatting of data across them would be different enough that this would actually be like a gargantuan task. So I think paying very close attention to language. It helps to be able to read Mandarin news coverage, and like also reading enough of that, you figure out kind of where the discrepancies are. You can look at companies' own statements. Like it's a lot of triangulating, but of course, fieldwork sometimes obliterates the whole thing. It's like, it doesn't matter how much I've read. I come and interview your company, and most of what I've found to be written on your website, you claim isn't true anymore, or maybe never was. So it's definitely a really slippery enterprise, but I would say paying really close attention to language and just like reading everything you can. And for people who don't have that linguistic kind of background, it's again just looking at these really broad general claims and asking yourself, how logistically would this happen? Does it sound kind of more fantastic than real?
Thank you so much, Shazida. I'm going to take the language cue and move on to a question for Sylvia by Melissa Lafkowitz, who's asking, did you see a push for social impact related projects? And Melissa's saying she's interested in the intersection between individual centric social welfare provisioning and entrepreneurialism.
Thank you for that question. I think social impact is such an important term when it comes to how some of these programs are being positioned, because there's often a built-in promise for impact and for scale that I think is mostly aimed at attracting various forms of investment. Investors seldom invest in actual products, but in the promise of scale and the promise of reach and impact, right? In the story, a startup or an entrepreneur can tell around that. And social impact, so for sure, is sort of at the heart of this, and some of this has shifted somewhat, or maybe not shifted, but there's definitely much more of a broader critique now around that sort of myth of startups promising to change the world. There's much more of a suspicion of that narrative, where people are saying, what are the consequences of that, of a kind of techno solutionism? I think that all of us have been talking about. So what you kind of see happening almost simultaneously is that on the one hand, people have challenged some of these claims of major social impact on societal change and promise of large-scale intervention on the one hand, and have even, really focused on the unintended consequences of that. So you see that sort of wrapped up in this broader critique and suspicion of Silicon Valley. And yet at the same time, there is still a narrative of social impact that is so well anchored in a range of institutional programs. Like again, I would just bring up my own university uses the phrase of social impact quite a bit when it comes to its own educational initiatives. So there's a kind of language of and promise of innovation that has already infiltrated not just investment and startup culture itself, but really also other institutions, and especially higher education as well. And so I think you see that claim to social impact as really centrally shaping a variety of contexts these days.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you for linking this back to the education sector. That's really, really fascinating. I have a question from Eddie Yang that I'm going to ask Graham. And it's a fairly fairly broad one, so I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are. And he's asking, what are China's comparative disadvantages in AI development and innovation?
Thanks. Well, that's a great question, and it's a big one. The first thing I would say is I would recommend looking at the China AI work from the Paulson Institute and Macro Polo, which have put together a fairly extensive series of research reports that look at this in various ways in terms of workforce resources, how many experts are trained in this type of thing, and comparative numbers and types of patents, where people are getting trained, and where the most successful businesses seem to be emerging. The thing that's fairly clear to me is that when it comes to advanced machine learning techniques, right now China does have a potential weakness in access to the top end semiconductors. This is the lever that the US government is trying to pull under the Trump administration to essentially, in my view, I think the US goal is to basically slow down Chinese technological progress. Now, that comes with a counter movement from the Chinese government, which for decades has had a goal of becoming more independent technologically, advancing the levels of technology which are available domestically without relying on potential enemies like the United States. And I think that eventually that type of advantage that the US is trying to exploit would evaporate, but it would take some time. And I think if you have a situation where there's a dependency on these physical inputs, that's a challenge. I mean, in terms of strength, it's not hard to understand. There are many very talented people in China, and frankly, I sorry I keep making it about the U.S., but this is sort of my area of work. But a lot of really great researchers and scientists and developers who are Chinese nationals have been happily working in the United States and now find themselves not welcome. And a lot of people are going back after their PhDs when they would have normally stayed to start a new company or to join one of the big ones in the United States. And I think fewer of the top, the most talented students out of China are probably going to be coming to the United States. So that, to the extent that China's strength had been integrated with US strength, and it really had not been a very nationally delineated AI application and innovation system, I think there is a bit more of a national separation, and it's hard to say exactly how that would turn out in the end. My hope is that the US effort to put a strong divide, to make technology development a more nationalistic domain, will find a sweet spot that increases the security people's sense of security, and then allow the things to move forward in a way that is more open, and go back to a situation where people don't feel as vulnerable and as much in a us versus them framework.
Thank you, Graham. I want to ask that same question to Shazida and Sylvia as well. Maybe if you wanted to add to that or comment further on that question.
I think Graham hit it really well. I mean, there's all of these other human factors as well. Like I just alluded to, data not necessarily being standardized even across government departments, right? There's, we've talked about scale so many times, and just there's so many regional differences in governance and norms that I've always found is where I keep seeing in new projects I pursue as well, just issues with linking up and making things work in a top-down fashion. It's never really as easy as it's made to sound.
I think I'm gonna ask the last audience question before I take chair's privilege, and we'll wrap with my last question. And this is a question for everybody. I would love to hear from Sylvia first. And this is about research. So Devin Leo is asking, how does your foreigner identity impact your research in China? And especially asking, they say, considering the strengthening political environment in China, can you still get information from Chinese people? Which I guess is a question about the how the changing geopolitical conditions affect your research, probably also your personal relationships, and if so, in what way? Maybe Sylvia, you could take this one first.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I always appreciate questions about method. I would start by saying, as an ethnographer, I am always very attuned to how my gender and my own race shapes what I notice and what I pay attention to and how people react to me. That's, an ongoing reflection and something that is at the heart of feminist ethnography, and to speak from that positionality and challenge any claims of sort of universal truth about another culture. So I think that feminist approach to conducting ethnographic research, and really any kind of research, is also very well suited and helpful in this current moment where we face new challenges of geopolitical tensions, where it's harder maybe to travel and harder to build close relationships. So for me personally, just, I've lived in China for many years, and I've remained in close contact with many of the people I've worked with when I was there full time. And so per se, it hasn't, impacted me personally that people would choose not to talk to me anymore. But what has certainly shaped, my own experience is in part how US-China relationships are being depicted in increasingly binary terms or increasingly nationalistic terms, as Graham, I think, was emphasizing several times, and what that means for, researchers, and especially some of my students being positioned at an American university, and what it means for their future, right? So I'm thinking a lot about what does that mean for the next generation of researchers and ethnographers who might still build some of these relationships, And so, yeah, so it's an important question. I think one way of going about this is that I think what I said earlier in terms of like taking a position and being very clear about your position and taking a stance and being accountable for your methods and for your engagement has always been so important with any research, but is especially so important now. So that's something I would very strongly advocate for.
Shazida, do you want to answer that question next?
Sure. I don't have a whole lot to say about this because, I do feel incredibly lucky to have gotten the access I did. I think it's really different for me. I've noticed over the years of going to China that I used to have to deal with bewilderment that, like, you're American, but you're South Asian. How does that work? And just noticing over time as fewer people asked me about that. And it was just sort of taken for granted that I was American. And that there are interesting moments, right, when you have collaborators especially looking out for you and trying to invite you to conferences because they know you want to partake in this, this field. That there were conferences one of my collaborators would try to get me invited to and find out, oh, well, they have to actually go through the university and get permission to let a foreigner come. So unless they get that in time, you can't come. And that was like a whole process I never knew about until I was now put in these situations. And so whenever I did go to conferences, I always thought about that there was a process. You weren't just another participant, like you were always extremely visible even before you got here.
Thanks, Shazida. Graham, do you want to add your experience as well?
Sure. Well, it's a little different for me, because I don't conduct research in this particular way, but my experience is that my nationality is a key. It's the point of many of the engagements that I have, because we're talking about U.S.-China relations and comparing, policy approaches in our respective countries and what they mean for one another's policies. So it's frankly a lot easier, in addition to being, white and male and privileged to be at a nice university and from the U.S. and all that. But it's, so it's not as, I think, problematic for me, but I do think it, if I were to try to get to the ground truth, so to speak, and to get, as I was sort of mentioning earlier, I know a fair amount about what's written in plans and what policy makers and policy formulators discuss, but it takes people like Sylvia and Shazita and many others who do much more detailed, concrete field work to figure out what the hell is actually going on, because I'm confident that I know that the things said in the policies are not literally happening, but finding out what's really happening is a process of trusting many scholars, both Chinese and foreign, and trying to read through it.
Thanks for that, Graham. Thanks, Shazita and Sylvia, for your insight as well. We're sharp at time, and I think this last question was so wonderful, and it was wonderful to kind of close with your research experience. So I'm going to leave it at that. I have a ton more questions around ethics, about localism, the pandemic, and the climate emergency, but that's all for another day. I hope we can reconvene, hopefully in person, sometime next year. I want to plug the book again. This is Sylvia's wonderful new book, Prototype Nation, China and the Contested Promise of Innovation, now out from Princeton University Press. Thank you all so much for joining me today, Shazita Ahmed, Sylvia Lindner, and Graham Webster. It was such an honor to have you. It was a wonderful conversation. Where can we find you, Shazita?
I'm off Twitter.
On the internet.
Yeah, on the Berkeley iSchool website.
Wonderful. Thank you. Graham, where can we find you?
I probably spend too much time on Twitter, so you can get me there, or easy to Google and send an email.
Terrific. Thanks. And Sylvia, where can fans find you?
Same. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, WeChat, also my personal website, just my name, sylvialindner.com. Looking forward to your comments.
Thank you so much. At which point, I'm going to close today's Co-opting AI on China with a terrific conversation. We are going to have our next Co-opting AI event after the US election next month, and it's going to be on truth. The next Co-opting AI event on truth, the next IPK event, which is going to be The Shift, will be this Friday at 5 p.m. on art and activism. Again, a huge thanks to the terrific panel. Thank you for indulging me and for bringing these terrific thoughts. Thanks to the audience for tuning in, and I hope to see you all